Throughout this last year, we've been working with CLG, our counterpart government department, on really cranking up the quality of this. And it'll effectively have a relaunch in April next year as a much more robust framework with stronger oversight. The two parts I just wanted to pull out to discuss with you. One, it will always start with a fabric assessment. That is looking at all the attributes of the property, saying what you have already, taking that into account and saying what could create energy efficiency improvements. The new thing that we're going to introduce, which is sort of suggested by the sort of the green package, is a follow-up discussion on your energy use as the first householder that could take out the Green Deal. The issue of underheating then becomes very relevant, because if you go to a household where they're a professional couple, they're very rarely at home, you might want to say to them, you aren't using enough energy to create a saving. There could be other reasons it's still good for you to do a Green Deal. You might want to rent out that property at some stage. You know, in an ideal world, it would improve your the price or the value of the property. But we are going to have that sort of financial-based discussion following the assessment, so people don't blindly go on the basis of a typical or assumed performance. They will have to have some discussion about how they actually use energy. I think this just confirms what we're doing to improve DECC. We're developing national occupational standard, a new qualification, and I'll come on to some of the accreditation. Let's just press on. Okay, this is, in terms of both installation and assessment, there is an oversight framework that we're creating in relation to Green Deal. DECC sits at the top just in terms of its sort of legislative and regulatory role that ultimately power rests with our Secretary of State. But lots of this will be work that is done on a day-to-day basis by an oversight body, which is something we hope to procure very soon. It will hold all the data, it will look after the standards, so we're developing, going across from the left-hand side on the third row down, British Standards Institute publicly available spec for installers and assessors is nearing final development. There'll be a Green Deal code of practice saying what a provider or installer or assessor should do, things that are allowable within that framework. And UCAS will maintain an oversight of certification bodies. In designing this framework, we've been really working very hard not to reinvent things that are there already, not to challenge where there are existing standards that are good enough, but also to challenge where standards don't look good enough. And some certification bodies will move reasonably seamlessly into this, and by assumption they will be covered. So, to take an example, a certification body like GasSafe, it may well be that when we reach agreement with UCAS, GasSafe members are straight away covered to be able to offer Green Deal. And when they are covered, they will have a kite mark that shows that they are actually registered, and that kite mark, whether it quite looks like that in the end, will take on a significance, because you will only be able to offer Green Deals, install Green Deals, if you are accredited under one of these bodies. Okay, colour of this probably doesn't help, but I'll try and read it out. Essentially, we're talking about three main models that we think are possible. There are other models for local government that I can touch on if you wish, but the three main models that we think may operate under the Green Deal framework as a whole. One is one-stop shop. There's a lot of talk when ministers present on Green Deal about big high street names. I have to say, some of those high street names have declared an interest in Green Deal, B&Q being one of those. But other names that are used have not actually declared, and from my day-to-day discussions, I don't know that they will declare. So If I could just say one thing, don't always assume that those names are in the ring. I think they're quite often used as shorthand for not the energy companies. It's not going to be run by the energy companies anymore. I think what I'm trying to explain with this chart is that the models go well beyond those sort of big corporates. So the top one is the sort of big corporate that wants to employ assessors, installers, and provide finance. It will do it all together. It will try and market it as a one-stop shop. There will always be breaks in the process, so between an assessment and the quote for a green deal, we'll have to have a very clear declaration of impartiality, but also how commercial interests, essentially they'll have to declare how commercial interests could have affected their first quote, and people will have to take that on board. But it's not a model we want to rule out. The second one is a bit of a variant on the first one in that you have a national brand, as happens under CERT. Some high street names provide insulation, some shops do, but it's actually another company that does either the assessment, the installation. Where the finance comes from could be the national brand or the high street name, or it could be another party to it all, a finance institution providing that. So this is really piecing together the subcontracts that allow an organisation to operate green deals. And they would do that very much on the basis of their brand and their consumer base. The bottom one is perhaps of more interest in that I'll come on to finance, but we have been speaking to the finance community about different models of financing. And one that we're giving serious consideration, and we know some finance providers are interested in, is not to be heavily involved or implicated in green deals, but just to offer finance for the accredited framework. And that is essentially a bank, not necessarily banks offering this, but it will operate like a bank in that if you were an installer or assessor and you're accredited and you can show that, and if you can bring together green deal jobs, you will be able to go to this sort of financial institution and they will offer you money to pay off the upfront costs, and they will recoup the charge back from the consumer. So that is definitely a model that we're giving serious consideration to, and I think it would be good to discuss that when we have our session later, because that could well be a model that works. As companies get smaller, it may be less possible to actually generate competitive finance to fund the measures, and finance will be priced into the Green Deal, so it could be less competitive. It could well be that representative bodies bring together the sort of grouping of businesses and attract that sort of finance. It doesn't have to be a finance institution, but it's the sort of high level that we'll need to aggregate to create competitive financing. Okay, this is an extension of the finance discussion, essentially, that the end game in terms of finance is that all the individual green deals with their repayment streams come together. It's called here, in the middle of this, special purpose vehicle warehouse. Essentially, when you start aggregating all the debts coming through to repay green deals, that's the sort of long-term, relatively stable finance that some of the finance community are looking for. The pension houses in particular, they're not looking for a quick gain, but that reasonably assured long-term repayment stream is what they're looking for. The more you can aggregate that, and the sooner you can go to a big aggregation of that, the sooner you can launch bonds on the capital market. I have to say finance isn't my strong suit, so I'm presenting someone else's slides here, but that's the theory, is that if you achieve scale in the first year or 2 years, you move to warehousing approaches where all of the providers move the repayments within a special purpose vehicle, and over time that sort of investment is sort of right for the pension companies in the capital markets. Okay, just coming to a conclusion, what are the key stages? I always take the precaution of not putting too many dates on this because, things can change. Okay, the first key stage coming up is Royal Assent. For those who don't know, we were in the Commons last week clearing one of the final stages for the Energy Bill. The Energy Bill is largely about Green Deal, and pretty much broadly there's cross-party consensus. As much as there's a bit of toing and froing and amendments are thrown in, there's general consensus that Green Deal is a good thing. People just generally want to see more detail. And that detail will come out more in the consultation, and that's due for late October this year. And you will have, I think, 10 weeks in which to feed in your responses to that. That will set out much more than we've been able to do in relation to primary, how we think this will operate, what are the models that are potentially available, and it will allow for sorts of views and debate about the operating structure. We'll have to lay statutory instruments next year, and then it will go into a development phase. Once we have the assurance that secondary legislation has been laid, it then falls to particularly the energy companies to commit to the administration of the financing. One of the things I didn't dwell on is that the energy companies will be responsible for processing all the repayment streams. Whoever moves into that property, whether they change energy provider, that will always be maintained, and that is a role that we require of the energy companies. And despite a little bit of a delay on the legislation over the summer, we are still on target to launch in October 2012. That's when the first proper green deals can be done that attach to the property. I've covered some of those parallel issues about standards accreditation. There'll be procurement at the same time for a remote advice service taking over from what the Energy Saving Trust and Carbon Trust have done. So there will be that level of remote advice. We think that's also good for competition, because if we had no remote advice at all and people were not sure what to do, it might be that they'd be more tempted to go to the big players that have call centre facilities already. We want an impartial voice in all of that, someone they can call, someone who can lead them from some technical schemes like FITS and RHI into what the Green Deal can do. Thank you, everyone. I hope that's at least covered some of the issues that are interesting to you, and I'm happy to take questions both in the session later on and any key points now. Thank you very much.